Okay, everyone, so now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Nazli Tarzi, who is an independent journalist and researcher with a focus on Iraq, and she will today be talking about the Iraqi Spring. She's also a former Kingston graduate, if I'm not mistaken, so welcome back. And she's also written for Middle East Eye and Al Jazeera and the New Arab, among others. So please go ahead.
Okay,
thank you very much.
So today I'm going to be talking about Iraq. Iraq fills up our newspapers, our headlines, our front pages, but I do feel that that happens for particular reasons, and the reasons that have brought me here today are very different. So I'm not going to provide an extensive overview of the last 15 years, but what cannot be discussed due to time restrictions has to be acknowledged throughout today's talk because it helps us to understand what I describe as Iraq's spring. So that's the legacy of 2003, the dissolution of civil servants and agencies that form national security institutions, the formation of a US-funded and backed untrained army, the Bremer edicts, that's Paul Bremer, the fiercest counterinsurgency operations that were fought in Fallujah, the installation of a US-friendly government and how ill-thought alliances backfired. These problems have lingered for over a decade, and as far as Iraq's people are concerned, they're still denied the right to resist. And as the title of one of Gareth Stamfeld's papers reads, Iraq remains the unstoppable force and the immovable object. So let's see why. I begin at 2009, which is 2 years earlier, Americans began the process of redeploying their troops. So it reignited the debate of whether there should be US personnel present in the country, which brings us on to the SOFA agreement, which stands for the status of US forces, and so this was going to replace the United Nations Security Council resolution that provided legal backing for the existence of American forces on Iraqi soil, and they needed a new legal basis, otherwise the Iraqi government has the right to expel these forces, and we know very well that that doesn't serve the interests of either side. So what more important, however, is how the SOFA agreement provides the green light to mercenaries, and that is Nikolai's area of expertise. I think at the time there were 194,000 mercenaries, which are foreign security firms present in Iraq. So what happened during the SOFA agreement, once it was eventually signed under Nouri al-Maliki's government, is that they reshifted these troops. They didn't vanish overnight. They were redeployed to oil installations, and there were some bases that grew so large. You have Al-Balad Air Base. I think its inhabitants grew to almost 140,000. So these are permanent US installations, and Bush nor the successive governments after him were willing to abandon them overnight. So this angered Iraqis. Okay, so you had, other than Nouri al-Maliki's government, that was the ruling government and collaborating, they have mutual interest with America, let's say, from the State of Law coalition. Other than that political bloc, there was a lot of opposition that was voiced by various actors, and they were all muted, other than populist leader Muqtada al-Sadr, which you may or may not have heard of, but Muqtada al-Sadr's opposition was covered by the media at the time, but other than him, there was little noise to be made. And on the point, back to the point of US mercenaries, the reason that this angered Iraqis was they read this as the continuation of America's imperialist ventures in their country. If America's presence was positive, I think the narrative on the ground would have been very much different, but that wasn't the case. And I don't know if you guys have read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, but it's the idea that out goes the soldier, in comes the economic hitman that is hired by security companies, engineering firms, and it's no longer the the best kept secret in US foreign policy. So as aggravating were the sham elections that Iraq had in 2010, which mirrored what had happened 5 years earlier during the first so-called democratic elections. that Americans helped push forward for back in 2005. So it's this constant betrayal of democracy. So the Iraqis are told, but you have a fledgling democracy, you have the right of the ballot box, and you can vote in those that serve your interests. But Iraqis are still to see that. These promises haven't come into fruition. Nouri al-Maliki, so Iraq's former prime minister that was forcibly removed and replaced with Haydar al-Abadi because of his divisive policies and general sectarian approach to governing the masses. You have Ayad Alawi, who is also of a Shia religious background, and I hate to use these terms, if I can just point out, as an Iraqi, as a human being. I do not like using these terms because I think they're very limiting. But when talking about different political factions and formed coalitions, it's important so that we're able to map them out. Ayad al-Alawi was a secular Shi'i actor who aligned himself with a great deal of Sunnis. He actually won the elections in 2010. He won a wafer-thin victory of 2 seats. So Maliki's coalition lost out, the ratio was 91 to 89. Maliki refused to concede defeat, which angered people. People back in Western Iraq and other provinces that feel marginalized by the central government felt that their votes had been stolen from them, had been robbed. So what Maliki did was he demanded for a manual recount, not once, not twice. Then you have the High Electoral Commission coming in. He's thinking they're going to save the day for him to recount the votes and overturn as much as 20 votes, which never happened. And I think eventually Ayad Alawi's bloc, which is called Iraqiyya, which the very word itself connotes sort of a unified identity. But I believe his bloc withdrew their candidacy because they were very unhappy at the disqualification of at least 499 candidates who were disqualified on alleged Ba'athist links. So the outlawed or dissolved Ba'ath party that was headed by Saddam Hussein, who was toppled when the Americans came in. This has been a repetitive card that's been played time and time again in order to sideline political opposition and to weaken any dissent. And that is exactly what happened. What emerged was a hung parliament situation. I know the term is used for Westminster rather than in Baghdad, but it describes very much what happened. There was a hung parliament, everyone was denied a majority, and they ended up having to, Maliki ended up having to align with another sort of radical-leaning Shi'i coalition, the National Iraqi Alliance, in order to secure the seats that he needed, a total of 163 in order to govern, and that is what happened against the wishes of the people of that country. So, on to 2011. So February 2012, February 12, 2011 marks the beginning of Iraq's own spring in a moment of what was described as a Bouazizi moment. So there was a man, 31-year-old from Mosul, father of 4, set himself alight in Tahrir Square. Ironically, it shares the same name as Egypt's Liberation Square. So it's just called Liberation Square, and people rallied there and stoked fears of what was called the Egyptian domino effect. The people would rise up and call for the toppling of not Mubarak but Maliki. Then you had February 25th, Iraqi staged what was called a Day of Rage. So you have mass mobilization both in online and offline spaces, calling for mass protests. And the demands at the time were kept very, very simple from what I can remember. So the demands at the time were the abolishment of the muhassasa system, so the sectarian ethnic, the quota system, which mirrors that you have in Lebanon. So they were calling for the abolishment of that. They were calling for the government to hold accountable everyone who's been implicated in corruption. And I believe they were calling for the last US troops to leave, which brings us back onto the anger that was boiling to the surface back in 2009. So a lot of people, and I've done extensive research on this, and I've spoken to a lot of figures who are intentionally anonymized, so they will not present themselves to the public media, and you'll later learn why that is. But they said from as early as 2009, you had the blueprints of an Iraqi Spring forming. So activists, predominantly who are based elsewhere because of the risks that they would face if they were to organize domestically, were meeting in places like Istanbul and Amman in order to form a new social movement. And that's what happened. So the Day of Rage was crushed violently. People were killed. I recommend you all read Amnesty International's report called Iraq's Day of Rage, in which you have detailed accounts and testimonies of what occurred and the sheer force with which the protests were quelled. The week after the Day of Rage, you had Nadimun, a movement called Nadimun. Nadimun in Arabic translates into "we regret." So we are regretful of having voted in Nouri Al-Maliki. And there are some quite interesting images. So this one of the hand. So the tip is that which people voted with. And I guess Nadimun is a sign of remorse for having brought in those people, and to depict it, they depicted the top end being cut off, which I think sort of screams, notions of morality, notions of betrayal, and notions that the people want to take back what was wrongfully usurped from them. People at the time said no to the Baathists, no to Maliki, our votes were stolen. What was interesting was police came out in sheer force as protesters tried to storm through the green zone, which we all know is the area that houses America's embassy. They tried to storm the green zone, and that's when security forces came out in force. And one lady, I believe, was interviewed by Al Jazeera at the time and told them all we wanted to do was peacefully break through to the green zone, to tell these people that this is not yours, this land is ours and will always be. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And the wild card, that's what saved Maliki at the time. And the wild card, once again, is Muqtada Sadr. Muqtada Sadr came out and he pledged solidarity with the protests, but also gave the Maliki government a 100-day ultimatum to fix or to implement the reform program that had long been promised but never implemented. So what happened? The protest movement was killed. So that brings us on to the impact. So a lot of people will be dismissive. They will say Iraq didn't have a spring. What spring? There were protests. People were bemoaning unemployment, electricity, blackouts. That's not necessarily true. It prompted a wave of resignations at the provincial level. Basra's mayor, so one of Iraq's richest oil provinces, had to step down. It exposed the regime's survival fears and self-interested coalitions. So instead of unifying in order to address these protests in a way where they, still looked good and acquiesced the people, didn't happen. Instead, people began to obsess with blaming this side and that side, and all it did was expose the existing fissures in these hastily formed coalitions. Maliki needed someone to single out. So of course he again pointed the finger at provincial officials, which doesn't look very good on him because he, with his blessings they have been appointed. Co-optation and cooperation with Sunni partners, which I will refer to as tokenized Sunnis. So these are people that have already accepted the political process in Baghdad, and whenever Maliki clicks his fingers, they come running and they become the face for the marginalized Sunni community, which they are not. Evading responsibility. So Maliki came out and said, guys, I'm willing to cut my salary by half. That in itself says a lot. Security sweeps. Dozens of people in the hundreds were rounded up. So they were singled out, cherry-picked as people trying to conspire against the government, which again killed the movement. At the time, Human Rights Watch said activists were detained, interrogated and beaten, signs that security officials had been tracking them down and ferreting them out. So it fizzled out ultimately. So these are T-walls or blast walls, and during the first phase, during the Day of Rage and then later Nadimun, these were toppled, and I think that in itself is interesting, and I don't have enough time to talk about how Baghdad, the cityscape of Baghdad was disfigured by processes of militarization and securitization. So I'm going to talk about the strategies, and we spoke briefly about cyberspace and activism and web literacy. So one of the main reasons that the content that was being circulated online didn't get any attention is the focus of media has been very limited over the years. They want to talk about gruesome civil conflict, sectarian bickering, terrorist groups. They don't really want to talk about the people. That doesn't make for, sexy reading. So people were creating posters online. They were mobilizing in what I call an emergent thawraji culture. Thawraji in Arabic comes from the word thawra, which means revolution. So you have this revolutionary culture sort of seeping through to the mainstream. So you have a Sharqiyya, an Iraqi satellite television station. They created a show called Bab al-Sharji. Anyone who knows Iraq will know that that's a very famous souk in one of the popular quarters in the city, called it the Iraqi Revolution 2011. And they aired a total of 17 programs throughout the holy month of Ramadan. Then you also have the power of the diaspora. So because of the restrictions that Iraqi activists have to navigate and have been navigating since 2003, or at least since the internet was up and running around 2005, 2006, the diaspora took this opportunity to get involved, to organize. So those on the outside were organizing, and those on the inside were leading. That's the general divide and how it worked. So the fate of many of these websites, however, was directly linked to the availability of funding. Later on, what's interesting, and this definitely is more apparent when the movement grows and snowballs and more people are trying to crush it, new narratives come to the fore. So narratives that everybody is Al-Qaeda, or these are insurgents, or these are affiliates of any named group, which ultimately now has become ISIS. So we were hearing this from the very beginning, but what had happened is because all the platforms, all the available avenues that were accessible to these activists were closed down, the armed, what is called the muqawama, so the armed resistance, which is not the same as terrorist movements. These are two separate things. The insurgency grew in response to America's occupation 24 hours after Allied coalition forces, steamrolled into the capital. So this was already a response that was in place. But what happened was those groups stepped in not to actively get involved in the protest, but to help spread the word, because their aim, which almost sort of it aligns with the aims of the protesters, is to overthrow the government or to hold them accountable. And these are not very well thought out objectives, but this is what the insurgency believes. So they started spreading the content. They said, if you're going to shut down the main lifeline back home, what we'll do is we'll expand it abroad. And that's exactly what they did. So this is one of the posters. As you can see, الثورة العراقية الكبرى, the Great Iraqi Revolution. And some of these have religious connotations to them, but generally speaking, the narrative online remained quite nationalistic, borderline chauvinistic. I think there were interesting comparisons being made between Iranian soldiers and Iraqi soldiers because of the animosity that was growing towards Iran in this particular period. Iran, for many Iraqis, and many other Iraqis would disagree, is the face of continued occupation in their country. Iran controls some of the most important Iraqi ministries. It controls some of the most agricultural industries. So Iran has a big part to play in what's been taking place. So there were analogies that Iranian soldiers equal dogs and Iraqi soldiers equal lions, and that was something that was discussed by a paper written by Ahmed al-Rawi for the Journal of Communications, which you guys should check out if interested. Phase 2. So phase 2. The Maliki's biggest mistake was his over-enthusiasm with himself, that I have successfully crushed this movement and I'm safe and it increases my longevity and my shelf life. But what actually happened was the activists behind the scenes began to redouble their efforts, because they said we need to find the opportunity to strike, and that's what they did. They took their time, but eventually it did strike. Maliki got very overconfident and he began to arrest some very high-ranking officials. And I love this picture just because it's quite ironic, because firstly it shows you the difference between sort of the bottom level and the top level of society. So state and society, the difference, the growing gap that separates it. And that face is the face of the financial minister, Rafi al-Isawi. Rafi al-Isawi's compound and home in December, on December the 30th, so towards the end of December 2012. So there isn't much of a gap as well between phase 1 and phase 2 if you read attentively. And he basically stormed Rafi al-Isawi's compound, which resulted in the death of a few of his guards and the arrest of 5 others. And on May the 1st, Rafi al-Isawi, and isn't the first minister of a Sunni religious background to come out and do this, but resigned over the matter. So what this did is it really it fanned the flames of what had already begun in January and February and throughout 2011. So what happened this time around was a new form of organizing. You had permanent protest camps that were established. These aren't the best pictures, but this is an information center that was set up. Also, the Iraqi Spring Media is one of the agencies that was spawned as a result of these growing spring movements. They rose in the first phase, but they went underground after and rose back up 8 days after Isawi's arrest, and that's one of their offices. I can't name where it is for security reasons. This is very interesting. So you can't see very much, but this is the incident in which Saleh al-Mutlaq, who is a member of the ruling government. He was the deputy prime minister, I believe, but that's him getting shooed at one of the protest camps in Fallujah. And what's interesting, the protest camp at the time was called Sahat al-Izz wal-Karama. People who speak Arabic would know that translates into the camp of the dignified and honourable, I'm not sure how else to translate it. So you can see, and sadly there was a gender disparity. We didn't see women out, and if I were to research this in more depth, I'd be fascinated to hear about the role of women during these 2 spring phases. But we may never know because of how conservative these parts of the country are. But the men were out in force, and it was a battle of honor, you could say, and that's what the shoe here symbolizes. Here you have, unfortunately I don't have the time to talk about this, but I encourage you all to read about this. These are former members of the awakening surge when back in 2006 and 2007, when Al-Qaeda became particularly fearful in what it was waging in Western provinces, which are Sunni majority areas, Americans struck up the best military deal in history. This deal saved them millions and billions of dollars. That deal was to collaborate with local forces who eventually sold intelligence and reshifted their alignments, their political alignments, economic alignments. Some of them were people who had stolen big funds that the insurgency claimed were theirs. So these were not people with clean records. And they were the ones that are credited for having expelled Al-Qaeda. So what happened when the government of Maliki forms, Maliki strikes up an alliance with these guys, because these guys want seats in power. They're not interested in how politics is conducted, so long as they have a seat, so long as they have a slice of the Iraqi pie. And they were the ones that began to infiltrate the movement. So this is really what separates phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 didn't have much infiltration. Pretty much people successfully, so these are the actors, it very much goes over what I said. But in phase 1, religious actors were sidelined as far as they could be. In the second phase, they jump in, and what they did was they quickly called for the creation of a Sunni enclave, right? So already you see how they've hijacked the movement and tried to change the narrative. And I'll explain why, because it's slightly difficult for one to get their heads around. So they jumped into the protest movement and said, look at all these people, they're angry, and they all want a Sunni enclave. No, they didn't. What they wanted was they wanted the removal of Nouri Al-Maliki's government. And so what the protesters did in response was quickly adopt calls for the fall of the regime. So this is also where the narrative swerves. The first one, we spoke about 3 demands. We spoke about the end of for the last present US forces to leave, for the end of the Muhassasa sectarian ethnic quota system, and also for legal action to be taken against corrupted figures. At this point, sorry, I'll go back to those images. These are the new demands. These are all the demands that were being raised. So it was an all-out war. So what they were saying, the activists that tend to fall under the nationalistic umbrella. So the nationalist front, so these are the groups that fall under them. What they were saying to the hijackers from the Sahwa and from the Islamic Party, which is in the government in Baghdad, it was saying to them, we're going to deny you any perceived legitimacy if this is the game that you are going to play. And this is exactly what happened. And one thing that they did to activate that was to raise the old Iraqi flag. And I don't know if you guys know much about Iraq's flag, but when America came in 2003, and I think 2 years after, a new flag was recognized as the national flag. And the only difference between this new flag and the old flag was that the stars were removed. Those stars were not added by Saddam Hussein. Those stars were added by the former communist government in Iraq. And what Saddam did was he added the words Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. And so it's quite ironic, that this flag, the moment this flag goes up, there are sirens screaming Ba'ath, Ba'ath, Ba'athist, Ba'athist. And what's ironic is you took out something that wasn't really added by the former regime. He added words that are of religious importance and are revered across the entire nation and global Arab world. So this was interesting. It was seeing activists playing politics. They were disadvantaged. They didn't have the superiority or force of arms on their side, but still they managed to lead by example, and others did follow, and that's what happened. I'm going to try and just see if I can, because this is a gallery and there are lots of pictures, but unfortunately the rendered version has removed them, but it doesn't prevent us from being able to look at them. Okay. I'm going to just enlarge my screen and hold it up for everyone to see, just so you can visualize what was actually happening. This has to follow. So if you can see, they're putting on sort of protective plastic because of winter conditions. So these were real big tents. We're talking tented cities. That's the turnout at one of them in Ramadi. This is, of course, the Islamic Party, the lovely Islamic Party, hijacking the scene. Lovely Islamists. This is Abu Risha. He's one of the Sahwa commanders, again credited with his participation against Al-Qaeda. This guy's interesting. This is another Abu Risha, but his name's Muhammad Khamis Abu Risha, and he was one of the small Sahwa players, but what he did was he played both sides against the other. So he teamed up with ISIS later, but he also teamed up with every political side, so the Islamists and the activists, and he got killed because of it. So he ended up being killed in a blast. Then we have Majlis al-Shabab al-Thawra. So Majlis al-Shabab al-Thawra was the Youth Revolutionary Council, and this is one of the groups to have surfaced. Their name came up in the list of actors. But these guys were brilliant. They organized lots of community outreach initiatives. There was a marathon, there were regular banquets that were held. I believe they organized their own referendum in which the youth of these protest campsites got to vote on their own future. They did a great deal, so that has to be acknowledged and they have to be commended. So that's them. ندوة البطالة مشاكل وحلول. So problem of unemployment. This is a seminar, so they're talking about problems and solutions, which is fantastic. So also what they did was they recruited famous celebrity activists, Iraqi activists. Everybody knows the guy that shooed George Bush. Muntadha al-Zaidi was invited and made an appearance. Hana Adwar, if you don't know her, get to know her, is the founder and general secretary of the Iraqi ML Association that helps women. She also went to Fallujah. So here's people really traversing these sectarian divisions that are peddled, the myths of which are peddled by mainstream media. Ordinary people, what was great for me to see is to see people with physical handicaps appear in these sites, and to be accommodated as well. You see real respectful exchanges taking place. Young kids out in show, more young children. This is interesting. This is one of Maliki's men, one of the activists at the time sent this to a group, and I managed to get hold of it. One of Maliki's thugs trying to record the activists. So there's strategies of mirroring. They're saying, if you're going to intimidate me, I will intimidate you, and I'll be as ruthless. And then you have the media agencies, the localized media agencies that were born as a result of the spring. So here I talk about now the crushing of the spring. So more. During the Day of Rage, there were people that were killed. These were their faces on billboards for everybody to see in Fallujah. This was when the procession was taking place in Fallujah as well. Here you have dissent being voiced against Iran. Okay. So Iraq's year-old sit-in ends bloodily. These sprawling protest squares and sites became a small microcosm of political rivalries and the politics of opportunism that's played out in Baghdad. Efforts to prolong the protests were effective, but the infiltration of various actors also stifled their success. The narrative of Al-Qaeda gained traction in English-speaking press. Many ignored opportunistic alliances that were built and payoffs to Islamic Party members who planted ominous black flags similar to those later carried by the Islamic State groups. So it's interesting when you look through the archives that this comes up more than any explanation of actually what took place. It doesn't really help when you have Sahwa members collaborating with Western press to reinforce that narrative, to say, yes, Al-Qaeda wants to establish its HQ here. I'm not sure how that message has received this person, but again, you see how this narrative is really gaining a life of its own. Excessive force and technologies of violence alongside the acquiescence and co-optation of political Sunni components killed the spring. Maliki did not stop there. In retaliation, some individuals were killed, execution-style by thugs and squads he commands. These were distributed online as well, and rights organizations are still investigating them till this day, because it wasn't that long ago that these things happened. Mass funerals were held in honor of the fallen, which prompted new rallies and brief protests. The general approach within the international community, which is different from any other country in the Middle East with respect to Iraq, has been to rehabilitate a failed state, to make excuses and turn a blind eye when its people seek to effect real change. After all, one cannot dismantle a government whose interests are bound up with his or hers. Disadvantaged activists persevered even when the world looked the other way, and when they got crushed, and successfully kept up the momentum and inspired the first and second phase, even if they were the less lucky the second time around. And I will leave you just with these notes. And as you can see as well, in terms of trying to communicate to the world outside, people were experimenting with different languages. So that's a sign in Spanish, and you also had a lot of content translation happening. And of course, there's so much more I'd like to add, but I will not take up any more of your time. And happy to hear. Yes, also would really like to hear from anyone if you had heard of Iraq Spring prior to this talk today, and how your perceptions then compared to now have changed at all. Or if you're surprised by anything or want to challenge me on anything I've said as well, you're welcome.